There's one thing, he thought to himself, they can't go on shooting. They'll have the police after them if they do. I wonder they dared to there. He heard the footsteps of his pursuers behind him, and redoubled his own pace. Once he got out of these byways he would safe. There would be a about somewhere, not that he really wanted to invoke the aid of the police if he could possibly do without it. It meant explanations, and general awkwardness. In another moment he had reason to bless his luck. He stumbled over a prostrate figure, which started up with a yell of alarm and dashed off down the street. Tommy drew back into a doorway. In a minute he had the pleasure of seeing his two pursuers, of whom the German was one, industriously tracking down the red herring. Tommy sat down quietly on the doorstep and allowed a few moments to elapse while he recovered his breath. Then he strolled gently in the opposite direction. He glanced at his watch. It was a little after 5:30. It was rapidly growing light. At the next corner he passed a policeman. The policeman cast a suspicious eye on him. Tommy felt slightly offended. Then, passing his hand over his face, he laughed. He had not shaved or washed for 3 days. What a guy he must look. He himself without more ado to a Turkish bath establishment which he knew to be open all night. He emerged into the busy daylight feeling himself once more, and able to make plans. First of all, he must have a square meal. He had eaten nothing since midday yesterday. He turned into an ABC shop and ordered eggs and bacon and coffee. Whilst he ate, he read a morning paper propped up in front of him. Suddenly he stiffened. There was a long article on Kremenin, who was described as the man behind Bolshevism in Russia, and who had just arrived in London, some thought as an unofficial envoy. His career was sketched lightly, and it was firmly asserted that he, and not the figurehead leaders, had been the author of the Russian Revolution. In the center of the page was his portrait. "So that's who number one is," said Tommy with his mouth full of eggs and bacon. "Not a doubt about it, I must push on." He paid for his breakfast, and betook himself to Whitehall. There he sent up his name, and the message that it was urgent. A few minutes later he was in the presence of the man who did not here go by the name of Mr. Carter. There was a 159 frown on his face. "Look here, you've no business to come asking for me in this way." "I thought that was distinctly understood." "It was, sir. But I judged it I'm 1x, returned to lose no time." And as briefly and succinctly as he detailed the experiences of the last few days. Halfway through, Mr. Carter interrupted him to give a few cryptic orders through the telephone. All traces of displeasure had now left his face. He nodded energetically when Tommy had finished. "Quite right. Every moment's of value. Fear we shall be late anyway." They wouldn't wait. Would clear out at once. Still, they may have left something behind them that will be a clue. "You say you've recognized number one to be Kremenin? That's important. We want something against him badly to prevent the cabinet falling on his neck too freely. What about the others? You say two faces were familiar to you? One's a labor man, you think? Just look through these photos, and see if you can spot him." A minute later, Tommy held one up. Mr. Carter exhibited some surprise. "Ah, Westway. Shouldn't have thought it. Poses as being Vuillerate. As for the other fellow, I think I can give a good guess." He handed another photograph to Tommy, and smiled at the other's exclamation. "I'm right, then. Who is he?" "Irishman. Prominent Unionist MP. All a blind, of course. We've suspected it but couldn't get any proof." "Yes, you've done view well, young man. The 29th, you say, is the date. That gives us very little time indeed." But Tommy hesitated. Mr. Carter read his thoughts. "We can deal with the general strike now, I think. It's a toss-up but we've got a sporting chance. But if that draft treaty turns up we're done. England will be plunged in anarchy." "Ah, what's that? The car? Come on, Beresford, we'll go and have a look at this house of yours." 2 constables were on duty in front of the house in Soho. an inspector reported to Mr. Carter in a low voice. The latter turned to Tommy. 160. The birds have flown as we thought. We might as well go over it. Going over the deserted house seemed to Tommy to partake of the character of a dream. Everything was just as it had been. The prison room with the crooked pictures, the broken jug in the attic, the meeting with its long table. But nowhere was there a trace of papers. Everything of that kind had either been destroyed or taken away. And there was no sign of Annette. What you tell me about the girl puzzled me, said Mr. Carter. You believe that she deliberately went back? It would seem so, sir. She ran upstairs while I was getting the open. She must belong to the gang, then, but, being a woman, didn't feel like standing by to see a personable young man killed. But evidently she's in with them, or she wouldn't have gone back. I can't believe she's really one of them, sir. She seemed so different, I suppose, said Mr. Carter with a smile that made Tommy flush to the roots of his hair. He admitted Annette's rather shamefacedly. By the way, observed Mr. Carter, have you shown yourself to Miss Tuppence yet? She's been bombarding me with letters about you. Tuppence? I was afraid she might get a bit rattled. Did she go to the police? Mr. Carter shook his head. Then I wonder how they twigged me. Mr. Carter looked inquiringly at him, and Tommy explained. The other though tearfully. True, that's rather a curious unless the mention of the writs was an accidental remark. It might have been, sir. But they must have found out about me suddenly in some way. Well, said Mr. Carter, looking round him, there's nothing more to be done here. 161. What about some lunch with me? Thanks awfully, sir. But I think I'd better get back and rout out Tuppence. Of course. Give her my kind regards and tell her not to believe you're killed TCX, readily next time. Tommy grinned. I take a lot of killing, sir. So I perceive, said Mr. Carter dryly. Well, goodbye. You're a marked man now, and take reasonable care of yourself. Thank you, sir. Hailing a taxi briskly Tommy in, and was swiftly borne to the Ritz, dwelling the while on the pleasurable anticipation of startling Tuppence. Wonder what she's been up to. Dogging Rita most likely. By the way, I suppose that's who Annette meant by Marguerite. I didn't get it at the time. The thought saddened him a little, for it seemed to prove that Mrs. Vandermeyer and the girl were on intimate terms. The taxi drew up at the Ritz. Tommy burst into its sacred portals eagerly, but his enthusiasm received a check. He was informed that Miss Cowley had gone out a quarter of an hour ago. 162. Chapter 18. The telegram baffled for the moment, Tommy strolled into the restaurant, and ordered a meal of surpassing excellence. His 4 days' imprisonment had taught him anew to value good food. He was in the middle of conveying a particularly choice morsel of sole à la Jeanette to his mouth, when he caught sight of Julius entering the room. Tommy waved a menu cheerfully, and succeeded in attracting the other's attention. At the sight of Tommy, Julius's eyes seemed as though they would pop out of his head. He strode across, and pump-handled Tommy's hand with what seemed to the latter quite unnecessary vigor. Holy snakes, he ejaculated. Is it really you? Of course it is. Why shouldn't it be? Why shouldn't it be? Say, man, don't you know you've been given up for dead? I guess we'd have had a solemn requiem for you in another few days. Who thought I was dead? Demanded Tommy. Tuppence. She remembered the proverb about the gookle dying young, I suppose. There must be a certain amount of original sin in me to have survived. Where is Tuppence, by the way? Isn't she here? No, the fellows at the office said she'd just gone out. Gone shopping, I bless. I her here in the car an hour ago. But, say, can't you shed that British calm of yours, and get down to it? What on God's earth have you been doing all this time? If you're feeding here, replied Tommy, order now. It's going to be a long story. Julius drew up a chair to the opposite side of the table, summoned a hovering waiter, and dictated his wishes. Then he turned to Tommy. 163. Fire ahead. I guess you've had some few adventures. 1 or 2, replied Tommy modestly, and plunged into his recital. Julius listened spellbound. Half the dishes that were placed before him he forgot to eat. At the end he heaved a long sigh. Bully for you. Reads like a dime novel. And now for the home front, said Tommy, stretching out his hand for a peach. Well, drawled Julius, I don't mind admitting we've had some adventures too. He, in his turn, assumed the role of narrator. Beginning with his unsuccessful reconnoitring at Bournemouth, he passed on to his return to London, the buying of the car, the growing anxieties of Tuppence, the call upon Sir James, and the sensational occurrences of the previous night. But who killed her? Asked Tommy. I don't quite understand. The doctor kidded himself, she took it herself, replied Julius dryly. And Sir James? What did he think? Being a legal luminary, he is likewise a human oyster, replied Julius. I should say he reserved judgment. He went on to detail the events of the morning. Lost her memory, said Tommy with interest. By Jove, that explains why they looked at me so queerly when I spoke of questioning her. Bit of a slip on my part, that. But it wasn't the sort of thing a fellow would likely to guess. They didn't give you any sort of hint as to where Jane was. Tommy shook his head regretfully. Not a word. I'm a bit of an ass, as you know. I ought to have got more out of them somehow. I bless you're lucky to be here at all. That bluff of yours was the Goxlow's all right. How you ever came to think of it all so pat beats me to a frazzle. 164. I was in such a funk I had to think of something, said Tommy simply. There was a moment's pause, and then Tommy reverted to Mrs. Vandemeyer's death. There's no doubt it was chloral. I believe not. At least they call it heart failure induced by an overdose, or some such claptrap. It's all right. We don't want to be worried with an inquest. But I guess Tuppence and I and even the highbrow Sir James have all got the same idea. Mr. Brownie hazarded Tommy. Sure thing. Tommy nodded. All the same, he said thoughtfully, Mr. Brown hasn't got wings. I don't see how he got in and out. How about some high-class thought transference stunt? Some magnetic influence that irresistibly impelled Mrs. Vandemeyer to commit suicide. Tommy LCH'd at him with respect. Good, Julius. Distinctly the phrase 010U. But it leaves me cold. I yearn for a real Mr. Brown of flesh, and I think the gifted young detectives must get to work, study the entrances and exits, and tap the bumps on their foreheads until the solution of the mystery dawns on them. Let's go round to the scene of the crime. I wish we could get hold of Tuppence. The Ritz would enjoy the spectacle of the glad reunion. Inquiry at the office revealed the fact that Tuppence had not yet returned. All the same, I guess I'll have a look round upstairs, said Julius. She might be in my sitting RCK. He disappeared. Suddenly a diminutive boy spoke at Tommy's elbow. The young lady, she's gone away by train, I think, sir, he murmured shyly. 165 what? Tommy wheeled round upon him. The small boy became pinker than before. The taxi, sir. I heard her tell the driver Charing Cross and to look sharp. Tommy stared at him, his eyes wide in surprise. Emboldened, the small boy proceeded. So I thought, having asked for an ABC and a Bradshaw. Tommy interrupted him. When did she ask for an ABC and a Bradshaw? When I took her the telegram, sir. A telegram? Yes, sir. When was that? About 12:30, sir. Tell me exactly what happened. The small boy drew a long breath. I took up a telegram to know 891 the lady was there. She opened it and gave a gasp, and then she said, very jolly like, bring me up a Bradshaw, and an ABC, and look sharp, Henry. My name isn't Henw, but, never mind your name, said Tommy impatiently. Go on. Yes, sir. I brought them, and she told me to wait, and looked up something. And then she looks up at the clock, and hurry up, she says. Tell them to get me a taxi, and she a shoving on of her hat in front of the glass, and she was down in 2 ticks, almost as quick as I was, and I seed her going down the steps and into the taxi, and I heard her call out what I told you." The small boy stopped and replenished his lungs. Tommy continued to stare at him. At that moment Julius rejoined him. He held an open letter in his hand. 166, I say, turned to him. "Tuppence has gone off sleuthing on her own." "Shucks. Yes, she has. She went off in a taxi to Charing Cross in the deuce of a hurry after getting a telegram." His eye fell on the letter in Julius's hand. "Oh, she left a note for you. That's all right. Where's she off to?" Almost unconsciously, he held out his hand for the letter, but Julius folded it up and placed it in his pocket. He seemed a trifle embarrassed. "I bless this is nothing to do with it. It's about something else, something I asked her that she was to let me know about." "Oh." Tommy looked puzzled, and seemed waiting for more. "See here," said Julius suddenly, "I'd better put you wise. I asked Miss Tuppence to marry me this morning." "Oh," said Tommy mechanically. He felt dazed. Julius's words were totally unexpected. For the moment they benumbed his brain. "I'd like to tell you," continued Julius, "that before I suggested anything of the kind to Miss Tuppence, I made it clear that I didn't want to butt in any way between her and you." Tommy roused himself. "That's all right," he said quickly. "Tuppence and I have been pals for years. Nothing more." He lit a cigarette with a hand that shook ever so little. "That's quite all right. Tuppence always said that she was looking out for—" He stopped abruptly, his face crimsoning, but Julius was in no way discomposed. "Oh, I guess it'll be the dollars that'll do the trick. Miss Tuppence put me wise to that right away. There's no humbug, her. We ought to gee along together very well." Tommy eyed him curiously for a minute, as though he were about to speak, then changed his mind and said nothing. Tuppence and Julius. Well, why not? Had she not lamented the fact that she knew no rich men? Had she not 167 avowed her intention of marrying for money if she ever had the chance? Her meeting with the young American millionaire had given her the chance, and it was unlikely she would be slow to avail herself of it. She was out for money. She had always said so. Why blame her because she had been true to her creed? Nevertheless, Tommy did blame her. He was filled with a passionate and utterly illogical resentment. It was all very well to say things like that, but a real girl would never marry for money. Tuppence was utterly cold-blooded and selfish, and he would be delighted if he never saw her again. And it was a rotten world. Julius's voice broke in on these meditations. "Yes, we ought to get along together very well. I've heard that a girl always refuses you once, a sort of convention." Tommy caught his arm. "Refuses? Did you say refuses?" "Sure thing. Didn't I tell you that? She just rapped out a no without any kind of reason to it. The eternal feminine, the Huns call it, I've heard. But she'll come round right enough." "Likely enough. I hustled her some," but Tommy interrupted regardless of decorum. "What did she say in that note?" he demanded fiercely. The obliging Julius handed it to him. "There's no earthly clue in it as to where she's gone," he assured Tommy. "You might as well see for yourself if you don't believe me." The note, in well-known schoolboy writing, ran as follows: "Dear Julius, but it's always better to have things in black and white. I don't feel I can be bothered to think of marriage until Tommy is found. Let's leave it till then. Yours affectionately, Tuppence." 168. Tommy handed it back, his eyes shining. His feelings had undergone a sharp reaction. He now felt that Tuppence was all that was noble and disinterested. Had she not refused Julius without hesitation? True, the note signs of weakening, but he could excuse that. It read almost like a bribe to Julius to spur him on in his efforts to find Tommy, but he supposed she had not really meant it that way. Darling Tuppence, there was not a girl in the world to touch her. When he saw her dash, his thoughts were brought up with a sudden jerk. "As you say," he remarked, pulling himself together, "there's not a hint here as to what she's up to. Hi, Henry." The small boy came obediently. Tommy produced 5 shillings. "One thing more. Do you remember what the young lady did with the telegram?" Henry gasped and spoke. She crumpled it up into a ball and threw it into the grate, and made a sort of noise like "Hoop, sir." "Very graphic, Henry," said Tommy. "Here's your 5 shillings. Come on, Julius. We must find that telegram." They hurried upstairs. Tuppence had left the key in her door. The room was as she had left it. In the fireplace was a crumpled ball of orange and white. Tommy disentangled it and smoothed out the telegram. "Come at once, Moat House, Ebury, Yorkshire, great developments, Tommy." They linked at each other in stupefaction. Julius spoke first. "You didn't send it?" "Of course not. What does it mean?" "I bless it means the worst," said Julius quietly. "What?" "They've got her." "Sure thing. They signed your name, and she fell into the trap like a lamb." 169, my genie. "What shall we do?" "Get busy, and go after her. Right now. There's no time to waste. It's almighty luck that she didn't take the wire with her. If she had, we'd probably never have traced her. But we've got to hustle. Where's that Bradshaw?" The NRU of Julius was infectious. Left to himself, Tommy would probably have sat down to think things out for a good half-hour before he decided on a plan of action. But with Julius Herzheimer about, hustling was inevitable. After a few muttered imprecations, he handed the Bradshaw to Tommy as being more conversant with its mysteries. Tommy abandoned it in favor of an ABC. "Here we are. Ebury, Yorks. From King's Cross. Or St. Pancras. Boy must have made a mistake. It was King's Cross, not Charing Cross. 12.50, that's the train she went by. 2.10, that's gone. 3.20 is the next, and a demmed slow train too." "What about the car?" Tommy shook his head. "Send it up if you like, but we'd better stick to the train. The great thing is to keep." Julius groaned. "That's so. But it gets my goat to think of that innocent young girl in danger." Tommy nodded abstractedly. He was thinking. In a moment or two, he said, "I say, Julius, what do they want her for, anyway?" "Eh? I don't get you." "What I mean is that I don't think it's their game to do her any harm," explained Tommy, puckering his brow with the strain of his mental. "She's a hostage, that's what she is. She's in no immediate danger. If we tumble onto anything, she'd be demmed useful to them. As long as they've got her, they've got the whip hand of us. See?" "Sure thing," said Julius thoughtfully. "That's so. 170 besides," added Tommy, as an afterthought, "I've great faith in Tuppenny." The journey was wearisome, with many stops, and crowded carriages. They had to change twice, once at Doncaster, once at a small junction. Ebury was a deserted station with a solitary porter, to whom Tommy addressed himself. "Can you tell me the way to the Moat House?" "The Moat House? It's a tidy step from here." "The big house near the sea, you mean?" Tommy assented brazenly. After listening to the porter's meticulous but perplexing directions, they prepared to leave the station. It was beginning to rain, and they turned up the collars of their coats as they trudged through the slush of the road. Suddenly Tommy halted. "Wait a moment." He ran back to the station and tackled the porter anew. "Look here, do you remember a young lady who arrived by an earlier train, the 12.50 from London? She'd probably ask you the way to the Moat House." He described Tuppence as well as he could, but the porter shook his head. Several people had arrived by the train in question. He could not call to mind one young lady in particular. But he was quite certain that no one had asked him the way to the Moat House. Tommy rejoined Julius, and explained. Depression was settling on him like a leaden weight. He felt convinced that their quest was going to be unsuccessful. The enemy had over 3 hours' start. 3 hours was more than enough for Mr. Brown. He would not ignore the possibility of the telegram having been found. The way seemed endless. Once they took the wrong turning and went nearly half a mile out of their direction. It was past 7 o'clock when a small boy told them that T-Moat House was just past the next corner. A rusty iron gate swinging dismally on its hinges. An overgrown drive thick with leaves. There was something about the place that struck a chill to both their hearts. They went up the deserted drive. The leaves deadened their footsteps. The daylight was almost gone. It was like walking in a world of ghosts. Overhead the branches flapped and creaked with a mournful note. Occasionally a leaf drifted silently down, startling them with its cold touch on their cheek. 171. A turn of the drive brought them in sight of the house. That, too, seemed empty and deserted. The shutters were closed, the steps up to the door overgrown with moss. Was it indeed to this desolate spot that Tuppence had been decoyed? It seemed hard to believe that a human footstep had passed this way for months. Julius jerked the rusty bell handle. A jangling peal rang discordantly, echoing through the emptiness within. No one came. They rang again and again, but there was no sign of life. Then they walked completely round the house. Everick Vayer silence, and shuttered windows. If they could believe the evidence of their eyes, the place was empty. Nothing doing, said Julius. They retraced their steps slowly to the gate. There must a village handy, continued the young American. We'd better make inquiries there. They'll know something the place, and whether there's been anyone there lately. Yes, that's not a bad idea. Proceeding up the road, they soon came to a little hamlet. On the outskirts of it, they met a workman swinging his bag of and Tommy him with a question. The Moat House? It's empty. Been empty for years. Mrs. Sweeney's got the key if you want to go over it next to the post office. Tommy thanked him. They soon found the post office, which was also a sweet and general fancy shop, and knocked at the door of the cottage next to it. A clean, wholesome-looking woman opened it. She readily produced the key of the Moat House. Though I doubt if it's the kind of place to suit you, sir. In a terrible state of repair. Ceilings leaking and all. 'Twould need a lot of money spent on it. Thanks, said Tommy cheerily. I dare say it'll be a washout, but houses are scarce nowadays. That they are, declared the woman heartily. My daughter and son-in-law have been looking for a decent cottage for I don't know how long. It's all the war. Upset things terribly, it has. But excuse me, sir, it'll be too dark for you to see much of 172 the house. Hadn't you better wait until tomorrow? That's all right. We'll have a look around this evening, anyway. We'd have been here before only we lost our way. What's the best place to stay at for the night round here? Mrs. Sweeney looked doubtful. There's the Yorkshire Arms, but it's not much of a place for gentlemen like you. Oh, it will do very well. Thanks. By the way, you've not had a young lady here asking for this key today. The woman shook her head. No one's been over the place for a long time. Thanks very much. They retraced their steps to the Moat House. As the front door swung back on its hinges, protesting loudly, Julius struck a match and examined the floor carefully. Then he shook his head. I'd swear no one's passed this way. Look at the dust. Thick. Not a sign of a footmark. They wandered round the deserted house. Everywhere here the same tale. Thick layers of dust apparently undisturbed. This gets me, said Julius. I don't believe was ever in this house. She must have been. Julius shook his head without replying. We'll go over it again tomorrow, said Tommy. Perhaps we'll see more in the daylight. On the morrow they took up the search once more, and were reluctantly forced to the conclusion that the house had not been invaded for some considerable time. They might have left the village altogether but for a fortunate discovery of Tommy's. As they were retracing their steps to the gate, he gave a sudden cry. 173. And stooping, picked something up from among the leaves, and held it out to Julius. It was a small gold brooch. That's twopennys. Are you sure? Absolutely. I've often seen her wear it. Julius drew a deep breath. I bless that settles it. She came as far as here, anyway. We'll make that pub our headquarters, and raise hell round here until we find her. Somebody must have seen her. Forthwith the campaign began. Tommy and Julius worked separately and together, but the result was the same. Nobody answering to Tuppence's description had been seen in the vicinity. They were baffled but not discouraged. Finally they altered their tactics. Tuppence had certainly not remained long in the neighborhood of the moat house. That pointed to her having been overcome and carried away in a car. They renewed inquiries. Had anyone seen a car standing somewhere near the moat house that day? Again they met with no success. Julius wired to town for his own car, and they scoured the neighborhood daily with unflagging zeal. A gray limousine on which they had set high hopes was traced to Harrogate, and turned out to be the property of a highly respectable maiden lady. Each day saw them set out on a new quest. Julius was like a hound on the leash. He followed up the slenderest clue. Every car that had passed through the village on the fateful day was tracked down. He forced his way into country properties and submitted the owners of the motors to a searching cross-examination. His apologies were as thorough as his methods, and seldom failed in disarming the indignation of his victims, but, as day succeeded day, they were no nearer to discovering Tuppence's whereabouts. So well had the abduction been planned that the girl seemed literally to have vanished into thin air. And another preoccupation was weighing on Tommy's mind. "Do you know how long we've been here?" he asked one morning as they sat facing each other at breakfast. "A week. We're no nearer to finding Tuppence, and next Sunday is the 29th. 174 shucks, said Julius thoughtfully. I'd almost forgotten about the 29th. I've thinking of nothing but Tuppence. So have I. At least, I hadn't forgotten about the 29th, but it didn't seem to matter a damn in comparison to finding Tuppence. But today's the 23rd, and time's getting short. If we're ever going to get hold of her at all, we must do it before the 29th. Her life won't be worth an hour's purchase afterwards. The hostage game will be played out by then. I'm to feel that we've made a big mistake in the way we've set about this. We've wasted time and we're no forator. I'm with you there. We've been a couple of mutts, who've bitten off a bigger bit than they can chew. I'm going to quit fooling right away. What do you mean? I'll tell you. I'm going to do what we ought to have done a week ago. I'm going right back to London to put the case in the hands of your British police. We fancied ourselves as sleuths. Sleuths. It was a piece of damn foolishness. I'm through. I've had enough of it. Scotland Yard for me. You're right, said Tommy slowly. I wish to God we'd gone there right away. Better late than never. We've been like a couple of babes playing, here we go round the mulberry bush. Now I'm going right along to Scotland Yard to ask them to take me by the hand and show me the way I should go. I guess the professional always scores over the amateur in the end. Are you along with me? Tommy shook his head. What's the good? One of us is enough. I might as well stay here and nose round a bit longer. Something might turn up. One never knows. Sure thing. Well, so long. I'll be back in a couple of shakes with a few inspectors along. I shall tell them to pick out their brightest and best. But the course of events was not to follow the plan Julius had laid down. Later in the day Tommy received a wire, "Join me Manchester Midland Hotel." Important news Julius. 1:75 at 7:30 that night Tommy alighted from a slow cross-country train. Julius was on the platform. Thought you'd come by this train if you weren't out when my wire arrived. Tommy grasped him by the arm. What is it? Is Tuppence found? Julius shook his head. No. But I found this waiting in London. Just arrived. He handed the telegraph form to the other. Tommy's eyes as he read, Jane Finn found. Come Manchester Midland Hotel immediately Peel Edgerton. Julius took the form back and folded it up. Queer, he said thoughtfully. I thought that Lavier chap had quit. 176 Chapter 19. Jane Finn, my train got in half an hour ago, explained Julius, as he led the way out of the station. I reckoned you'd come by this before I left London, and wired accordingly to Sir James. He's booked rooms for us, and will be round to dine at 8. What made you think he'd ceased to take any interest in the case? Asked Tommy curiously. What he said, replied Julius dryly. The old bird's as close as an oyster. Like all the darned lot of them, he wasn't going to commit himself till he was sure he could deliver the goods. I wonder, said Tommy thoughtfully. Julius turned on him. You wonder what? Whether that was his real reason. Sure. You bet your life it was. Tommy shook his head unconvinced. Sir James arrived punctually at 8 o'clock, and Julius introduced Tommy. Sir James shook hands with him warmly. I am delighted to make your acquaintance, Mr. Beresford. I have heard so much you from Miss Tuppence, he smiled involuntarily, that it really seems as though I already know you quite well. Thank you, sir, said Tommy with his cheerful grin. He scanned the great lawyer eagerly. Like Tuppence, he felt the magnetism of the other's personality. He was reminded of Mr. Carter. The two men, totally unlike so far as physical resemblance went, produced a similar effect. Beneath the weary manner of the one and the professional reserve of the other, lay the same quality of mind, keen-edged like a rapier. In the meantime he was conscious of Sir James's close scrutiny. When the lawyer 177 his eyes, the young man had the feeling that the other had read him through and through like an open BCHDK. He could not but wonder what the final judgment was, but there was little chance of learning that. Sir James took in everything, but gave out only what he chose. A proof of that occurred almost immediately the first greetings were over. Julius broke out into a flood of eager questions. How had Sir James managed to track the girl? Why had he not let them know that he was still working on the case? And so on. Sir James stroked his chin and smiled. At last he said, just so, just so. Well, she's found. And that's the great thing, isn't it? Come now, that's the great thing. Sure it is. But just how did you strike her trail? Miss Tuppence and I thought you'd quit for Goxlow and all. The lavier shot a lightning glance at him, then resumed operations on his chin. You thought that, did you? Did you really? Dear me. But I guess I can take it we were wrong, pursued Julius. Well, I don't know that I should go so far as to say that. But it's certainly fortunate for all parties that we've managed to find the young lady. But where is she? Demanded Julius, his thoughts flying off on another tack. Thought you'd be sure to bring her along. That would hardly be possible, said Sir James gravely. Why? Because the young lady was knocked down in a street accident, and has sustained slight injuries to the head. She was taken to the infirmary, and on recovering consciousness gave her name as Jane Finn. When Deschel heard that, I arranged for her to remove to the house of a doctor, a friend of mine, and wired at once for you. She relapsed into unconsciousness and has not spoken. She's not seriously hurt. 178. Oh, a bruise, and a cut or two, really, from a medical point of view, absurdly slight injuries to have produced such a condition. Her state is probably to be attributed to the mental shock consequent on recovering her MOW. It's come back, cried Julius excitedly. Sir James tapped the table rather impatiently. Undoubtedly, Mr. Hersheimer, since she was able to give her real name. I thought you had appreciated that point. And you just to be on the spot, said Tommy. Seems quite like a fairy tale. But Sir James was far too wary to be drawn. Coincidences are curious things, he said dryly. Nevertheless, Tommy was now certain of what he had before only suspected. Sir James's presence in Manchester was not accidental. Far from abandoning the case, as Julius supposed, he had by some means of his own successfully run the missing girl to earth. The only thing that puzzled Tommy was the reason for all this secrecy. He concluded that it was a foible of the legal mind. Julius was speaking. After dinner, he announced, I shall go right away and see Jane. That will be impossible, I fear, said Sir James. It is very unlikely they would allow her to see visitors at this time of night. I should suggest tomorrow morning about 10 o'clock. Julius flushed. There was something in Sir James which always stirred him to antagonism. It was a conflict of two masterful. All the same, I reckon I'll go round there tonight and see if I can't ginger them up to break through their silly rules. It will quite useless, Mr. Hersheimer." The words came out like the crack of a pistol, and Tommy up with a start. Julius was nervous and excited. The hand with which he raised his glass to his 179 lips shook slightly, but his eyes held Sir James's defiantly. For a moment the hostility between the two seemed likely to burst into flame, but in the end Julius lowered his eyes, defeated. "For the moment, I reckon you're the boss." "Thank you," said the other. "We will say 10OCLCN_ZK then." With consummate ease of manner he turned to Tommy. "I must confess, Mr. Beresford, that it was something of a surprise to me to see you here this evening. The last I heard of you was that your friends were in grave anxiety on your behalf. Nothing had been heard of you for some days, and Miss Tuppence was inclined to think you had got into difficulties." "I had, sir." Tommy grinned reminiscently. "I was never in a tighter place in my life." Helped out by questions from Sir James, he gave an abbreviated account of his adventures. The lawyer looked at him with renewed interest as he brought the tale to a close. "You got yourself out of a tight place very well," he said gravely. "I congratulate you. You displayed a great deal of ingenuity and carried your part through well." Tommy blushed, his face assuming a prawn-like hue at the praise. "I couldn't have got away but for the girl, sir." "No." Sir James smiled a little. "It was lucky for you she happened to take a fancy to you." Tommy appeared about to protest, but Sir James went on. "There's no doubt about her being one of the gang, I suppose." "I'm afraid not, sir. I thought perhaps they were keeping her there by force, but the way she acted didn't fit in with that. You see, she went back to them when she could have got away." Sir James nodded thoughtfully. "What did she say?" "Something about wanting to be taken to Marguerite." "Yes, sir. I suppose she meant Mrs. Vandmeyer. She always signed herself Rita Vandmeyer. All her friends spoke of her as Rita. 180 still, I suppose the girl must have been in the habit of calling her by her full name. And, at the moment she was crying out to her, Mrs. Vandmeyer was either dead or dying. Curious. There are one or two points that strike me as being obscure: their sudden change of attitude towards yourself, for instance. By the way, the house was raided, of course." "Yes, sir, but they'd all cleared out." "Naturally," said Sir James dryly. "And not a clue left behind." "I wonder." The lawyer tapped the table thoughtfully. Something in his voice made Tommy look up. Would this man's eyes have seen something where theirs had been blind? He spoke impulsively. "I wish you'd been there, sir, to go over the house." "I wish I had," said Sir James quietly. He sat for a moment in silence. Then he linked up. "And since then? What have you been doing?" For a moment, Tommy stared at him. Then it dawned on him that of course the lawyer did not know. "I forgot that you didn't know about Tuppence," he said slowly. The sickening anxiety, forgotten for a while in the excitement of knowing Jane Finn was found at last, swept over him again. The lawyer laid down his knife and fork sharply. "Has anything happened to Miss?" His voice was keen-edged. "She's disappeared," said Julius. "When?" "A week ago." Sir James's questions fairly shot out. Between them Tommy and Julius gave the 181 history of the last week and their futile search. Sir James went at once to the root of the matter. "A wire signed with your name?" "They knew enough of you both for that. They weren't sure of how much you had learned in that house. Their kidnapping of Miss Tuppence is the counter-move to your escape. If necessary they could seal your lips with a threat of what might happen to her." Tommy nodded. "That's just what I thought, sir." Sir James at him keenly. "You had worked that out, had you?" "Not bad, not at all bad. The curious thing is that they certainly did not know anything about you when they first held you prisoner. You are sure that you did not in any way disclose your identity?" Tommy shook his head. "That's so," said Julius with a nod. "Therefore I reckon someone put them wise, and not earlier than Sunday afternoon." "Yes, but who?" "That almighty omniscient Mr. Brown, of course." There was a faint note of derision in the American's voice which made Sir James link up sharply. "You don't believe in Mr. Brown, Mr. Hersheimer?" No, sir, I do not, returned the young American with emphasis. Not as such, that is to say. I reckon it out that he's a figurehead, just a boyar name to frighten the children with. The real head of this business is that Russian chap Kremenin. Guess he's quite capable of running revolutions in 3 countries at once if he chose. The man Whittington is probably the head of the English branch. I disagree with you, said Sir James shortly. Mr. Brown exists. He turned to Tommy. Did you happen to notice where that wire was handed in? No, sir, I'm afraid I didn't. 182 him. Got it with you? It's upstairs, sir, in my kit. I'd like to have a link at it sometime. No hurry. You've wasted a week. Tommy H. His day or so more is immaterial. We 11 deal with Miss Jane Finn first. Afterwards, we'll set to work to rescue Miss Tuppence from bondage. I don't think she's in any immediate danger. That is, so long as they don't know that we've got Jane Finn, and that her memory has returned. We must keep that dark at all costs. You understand? The other 2 assented, and, after making arrangements for meeting on the morrow, the great lawyer took his leave. At 10 o'clock, the 2 young men were at the appointed spot. Sir James had joined them on the he alone appeared unexcited. He introduced them to the store. Mr. Hershamer M.R. Beresford D.R. Roylance. How's the patient? Going on well. Evidently no idea of the flight of time. Asked this morning how many had been saved from the Lusitania. Was it in the papers yet? That, of course, was only what was to be. She seems to have something on her mind, though. I think we can relieve her anxiety. May we go up? Certainly. Tommy's heart beat sensibly faster as they followed the doctor upstairs. Jane Finn at last. The long-sought, the mysterious, the elusive Jane Finn. How wildly improbable success had seemed. And here in this house, her memory almost miraculously restored, lay the girl who held the future of England in her hands. A half-groan broke from Tommy's lips. If only Tuppence could have been at his side to share in the triumphant conclusion of their joint venture. Then he put the thought of Tuppence resolutely aside. His confidence in Sir James was growing. There was a man who would unerringly ferret out Tuppence's whereabouts. In the meantime Jane Finn. And suddenly a dread clutched at his heart. It seemed tcx, easy. Suppose they should find her dead, stricken down by the hand of Mr. Brown. 183. In another minute he was laughing at these melodramatic fancies. The doctor held open the door of a room and they passed in. On the white bed, bandages round her head, lay the girl. Somehow the whole scene seemed unreal. It was so exactly what one expected that it gave the effect of being beautifully staged. The girl looked from one to the other of them with large wondering eyes. Sir James spoke first. Miss Finn, he said, this is your Mr. Julius P. Hersheimer. A faint flush flitted over the girl's face, as Julius forward and took her. How do, Cousin Jane, he said lightly. But Tommy caught the tremor in his voice. Are you really Uncle Hiram's son? She asked wonderingly. Her voice, with the slight warmth of the Western accent, had an almost thrilling quality. It seemed vaguely familiar to Tommy, but he thrust the impression aside as impossible. Sure thing. We used to read about Uncle Hiram continued the girl, in her low soft tones. But I never thought I'd meet you one day. Mother figured it out that Uncle Hiram would never get over being mad with her. The old man was like that, admitted Julius. But I bless the new generation's sort of different. Got no use for the family feud business. First thing I thought about, soon as the war was over, was to come along and hunt you up. A shadow passed over the girl's face. They've been telling me dreadful things that my memory went, and that there are years I shall never know about, years lost out of my life. You didn't realize that you're P. The girl's eyes opened wide. 184. Why, no. It seems to me as though it were no time since we were being hustled into those boats. I can see it all now. She closed her eyes with a shudder. Julius across at Sir James, who nodded. Don't worry any. It isn't worth it. Now, see here, Jane, there's something we want to know about. There was a man aboard that boat with some mighty important papers on him, and the big guns in this country have got a notion that he passed on the to you. Is that so?" The girl hesitated, her glance shifting to the other two. "Julius understood. Mr. Beresford is commissioned by the British government to get those papers back. Sir James Peel Edgerton is an English member of Parliament, and might a big gun in the cabinet if he liked. It's owing to him that we've ferreted you out at last. So you can go right ahead and tell us the whole story. Did Danvers give you the papers?" "Yes. He said they'd have a better chance with me, because they would save the women and children first." "Just as we thought," said Sir James. "He said they were very important, that they might make all the difference to the Allies. But, if it's all so long ago, and the war's over, what does it matter now? I bless history repeats itself, Jane. First there was a great hue and over those papers, then it all died down, and now the whole caboodle's started all over again for rather different reasons. Then you can hand them over to us right away." "But I can't." "What?" "I haven't got them." "You haven't got them?" Julius punctuated the words with little pauses. "No, I hid them." "You hid them?" 185 Yes. I got uneasy. People seemed to watching me. It scared me badly. She put her hand to her head. "It's almost the last thing I remember before waking up in the hospital." "Go on," said Sir James, in his quiet penetrating tones. "What do you remember?" She turned to him obediently. "It was at Holyhead. I came that way, I don't remember why." "That doesn't matter. Go on." "In the confusion on the quay I slipped away. Nobody saw me. I took a car. Told the man to drive me out of the town. I watched when we got on the open road. No other car was following us. I saw a path at the side of the road. I told the man to wait." She paused, then went on. "The path led to the cliff, and down to the sea between big yellow gorse bushes. They were like golden flames. I looked round. There wasn't a soul in sight. But just level with my head there was a hole in the RCN_EK. It was quite small, I could only just get my hand in, but it went a long way back. I took the oilskin packet from round my neck and shoved it right in as far as I could. Then I tore off a bit of gorse but it did prick and plugged the hole with it so that you'd never guess there was a crevice of any kind there. Then I marked the place carefully in my own mind, so that I'd find it again. There was a queer boulder in the path just there, for all the world like a dog sitting up begging. Then I went back to the road. The car was waiting, and I drove back. I just caught the train. I was a bit ashamed of myself for fancying things maybe, but, by and by, I saw the man opposite me wink at a woman who was sitting next to me, and I felt scared again, and was glad the papers were safe. I went out in the corridor to get a little air. I thought I'd slip into another carriage. But the woman called me back, said I'd dropped something, and when I stooped to look, something seemed to hit me here." She placed her hand to the back of her head. "I don't remember anything more until I woke up in the hospital." There was a pause. "Thank you, Miss Finn." It was Sir James who spoke. "We have not tired." "Oh, that's all right. My head aches a little, but otherwise I feel fine." 186 Julius stepped forward and took her hand again. "So long, Cousin Jane. I'm going to get busy after those papers, but I'll back in 2 shakes of a dog's tail, and I'll tote you up to London and give you the time of your young life before we go back to the States. I mean it, so hurry up and get well." 187 Chapter 2 Late in the street they held an informal council of war. Sir James had drawn a watch from his pocket. "The boat train to Holyhead stops at Chester at 12.14. If you start at once I think you can catch the connection." Tommy looked up, puzzled. "Is there any need to hurry, sir? Today is only the 24th. "I bless, it's always well to get up early in the morning," said Julius, before the lawyer had time to reply. "We'll make tracks for the depot right away." A little frown had settled on Sir James's brow. "I wish I could come with you. I am due to speak at a meeting at 2 o'clock. It is unfortunate." The reluctance in his tone was very evident. It was clear, on the other hand, that Julius was easily disposed to put up with the loss of the other's company. "I bless there's nothing complicated about this deal," he remarked. "Just a game of hide-and-seek, that's all." "I hope so," said Sir James. "Sure thing. What else could it be? You are still young, Mr. Herzheimer. At my age you will probably have learned one lesson. Never underestimate your adversary." The gravity of his tone impressed Tommy, but had little effect upon Julius. "You think Mr. Brown might come along and take a hand? If he does, I'm ready for him." He slapped his PCW kit. "I carw a gun. Little Willie here travels round with me everywhere." He produced a murderous-looking automatic, and tapped it affectionately before returning it to its home. "But he won't be needed this trip. There's nobody to put Mr. Brown wise." The lawyer shrugged his shoulders. 188. There was nobody to put Mr. Brown wise to the fact that Mrs. Vandmeyer meant to betray him. Nevertheless, Mrs. Vandmeyer died without speaking. Julius was silenced for once, and Sir James added on a lighter note, "I only want to put you on your guard. Goodbye, and good luck. Take no unnecessary risks once the papers are in your hands. If there is any reason to believe that you have been shadowed, destroy them at once. Good luck to you. The game is in your hands now." He hands with them both. 10 minutes later the two young men were seated in a first-class carriage en route for Chester. For a long time neither of them spoke. When at length Julius broke the silence, it was with a totally unexpected remark. "Say," he observed thoughtfully, "did you ever make a darn fool of yourself over a girl's face?" Tommy, after a moment's astonishment, searched his mind. "Can't say I have," he replied at last. "Not that I can recollect, anyhow." "Why?" "Because for the last 2 months I've been making a sentimental idiot of myself over Jane. First moment I clapped eyes on her photograph my heart did all the usual stunts you read about in novels. I guess I'm ashamed to admit it, but I came over here determined to find her and fix it all up, and take her back as Mrs. Julius P. Herzheimer." "Oh," said Tommy, amazed. Julius uncrossed his legs brusquely and continued, "Just shows what an almighty fool a man can make of himself. One ichdk at the girl in the flesh, and I was cured." Feeling more tongue-tied than ever, Tommy ejaculated, "Oh," again. "No disparagement to Jane, mind you," continued the other. "She's a real nice girl, and some fellow will fall in love with her right away." 189. "I thought her a view girl," said Tommy, finding his tongue. "Sure she is. But she's not like her photo one bit. At least I suppose she is in a way must be because I recognized her right off. If I'd seen her in a crowd I'd have said, there's a girl whose face I know, right away without any hesitation. But there was something about that photo." Ju 1 shook his head, and heaved a sigh. "I guess romance is a mighty queer thing." "It must be," said Tommy coldly, "if you can come over here in love with one girl, and propose to another within a fortnight." Julius had the grace to look discomposed. "Well, you see, I'd got a sort of tired feeling that I'd never find Jane and that it was all plumb foolishness anyway. And then well, the French, for instance, are much more sensible in the way they look at things. They keep romance and marriage apart." Tommy flushed. "Well, I'm damned." "If that's—" Julius hastened to interrupt. "Say now, don't be hasty. I don't mean what you mean. I take it Americans have a higher opinion of morality than you have even. What I meant was that the French set about marriage in a businesslike way, find two people who are suited to one another, look after the money affairs, and see the whole thing practically, and in a businesslike spirit. If you ask me," said Tommy, "we're all too damned businesslike nowadays. We're always saying, will it pay? The men are bad enough, and the girls are .wrse. Cool down, son. Don't get so heated." "I feel heated," said Tommy. Julius looked at him and judged it wise to say no more. However, Tommy had plenty of time to cool down before they reached Holyhead, and the cheerful grin had returned to his countenance as they alighted at their 190 destination. After consultation, and with the aid of a road map, they were fairly well agreed as to direction, so were able to hire a taxi without more ado and drive out on the road leading to Treasure Bay. They instructed the man to go slowly, and watched narrowly so as not to miss the path. They came to it not long after leaving the town, and Tommy stopped the car promptly, asked in a casual tone whether the path led down to the sea, and hearing it did paid off the man in handsome style. A moment later the taxi was slowly chugging back to Holyhead. Tommy and Julius watched it out of sight, and then turned to the narrow path. "It's the right one?" I asked Tommy doubtfully. "There must be simply heaps along here." "Sure it is. Look at the gorse. Remember what Jane said?" Tommy looked at the swelling hedges of golden blossom which bordered the path on either side, and was convinced. They went down in single file, Julius leading. Twice Tommy turned his head uneasily. Julius looked back. "What is it?" "I don't know. I've got the wind up somehow. Keep fancying there's someone following us." "Can't be," said Julius positively. "We'd see him." Tommy had to admit that this was true. Nevertheless, his sense of uneasiness deepened. In spite of himself he believed in the omniscience of the enemy. "I rather wish that fellow would come along," said Julius. He patted his pocket. "Little William here is just aching for exercise." "Do you always carry him with you?" inquired Tommy with burning curiosity. "Most always. I guess you never know what might turn up." Tommy kept a respectful silence. He was impressed by little William. It seemed to remove the menace of Mr. Brown farther away. 191 The path was now running along the side of the cliff, parallel to the sea. Suddenly Julius came to such an abrupt halt that Tommy cannoned into him. "What's up?" he inquired. "Look there. If that doesn't beat the band." Tommy linked. Standing out half obstructing the path was a huge boulder which certainly inra a fanciful resemblance to a begging terrier. "Well," said Tommy, refusing to share Julius's emotion, "it's what we expected to see, isn't it?" Julius looked at him sadly and shook his head. "British phlegm. Sure we expected it, but it kind of rattles me, all the same, to see it sitting there just where we expected to find it." Tommy, whose calm was, perhaps, more assumed than natural, moved his feet impatiently. "Push on. What about the hole?" They scanned the cliffside narrowly. Tommy heard himself saying idiotically, "The gorse won't be there after all these years." And Julius replied solemnly, "I bless you're right." Tommy suddenly pointed with a shaking hand. "What about that crevice there?" Julius replied in an awe-stricken voice, "That's it for sure." They linked at each other. 192 When I was in France, said Tommy reminiscently, whenever my Batman failed to call me, he always said that he had come over queer. I never believed it. But whether he felt it or not, there is such a sensation. I've got it now. Badly. He looked at the RUK with a kind of agonized passion. "Damn it," he cried. "It's impossible. 5 years. Think of it. Birds nesting, boys, picnic parties, thousands of people passing. It can't be there. It's 100 to 1 against its being there. It's against all reason." Indeed, he felt it to be impossible more, perhaps, because he could not in his own success where so many others had failed. The thing was too easy, therefore it could not be. The hole would be empty. Julius looked at him with a widening smile. "I bless you're rattled now all right," he drawled with some enjoyment. "Well, here goes." He thrust his hand into the crevice, and made a slight grimace. "It's a tight fit. Jane's hand must be a few sizes smaller than mine. I don't feel anything no say. What's this? Gee whiz." And with a flourish he waved aloft a small discolored packet. "It's the all right. Sewn up in oilskin. Hold it while I get my penknife." The unbelievable had happened. Tommy held the precious packet tenderly between his hands. They had succeeded. "It's queer," he murmured idly, "you'd think the stitches would have rotted. They link just as good as new." They cut them carefully and ripped away the oilskin. Inside was a small folded sheet of paper. With trembling fingers they unfolded it. The sheet was blank. They stared at each other, puzzled. A dummy, hazarded Julius. Was Danvers just a decoy? Tommy shook his head. That solution did not satisfy him. Suddenly his face cleared. I've got it. Sympathetic ink. You think so? 193. Worth trying anyhow. Heat usually clays the trick. Get some sticks. We'll make in a few minutes. The little fire of twigs and leaves was blazing merrily. Tommy held the sheet of paper near the glow. The paper curled a little with the heat. Nothing more. Suddenly Julius his arm, and pointed to where characters were appearing in a faint brown color. Gee whiz. You've got it. Say, that idea of yours was great. It never occurred to Tommy held the paper in position some minutes longer until he judged the heat had done its work. Then he withdrew it. A moment later he uttered a cry. Across the sheet in neat brown printing ran the words, with the compliments of M.R. Brown. 194 Chapter XXI. Tommy makes a discovery. For a moment or two they stood staring at each other stupidly, dazed with the shock. Somehow, inexplicably, Mr. Brown had forestalled them. Tommy accepted defeat quietly. Not so Julius. How in tarnation did he get ahead of us? That's what beats me, he ended up. Tommy shook his head, and said dully. It accounts for the stitches being new. We might have guessed. Never mind the darned stitches. How did he get ahead of us? We hustled all we knew. It's downright impossible for anyone to get here quicker than we did. And, anyway, how did he know? Do you reckon there was a dictaphone in Jane's RCX, M? I guess there must have been. But Tommy's common sense pointed out objections. No one could have known beforehand that she was going to in that house, much less that particular room. That's so, admitted Julius. Then one of the nurses was a crook and listened at the door. How's that? I don't see that it matters anyway, said Tommy wearily. He may have found out some months ago, and removed the papers, then no, by Jove, that won't wash. They'd have been published at once. Sure thing they would. No, someone's got ahead of us today by an hour or so. But how they did it gets my goat. I wish that chap Peel Edgerton had been with us, said Tommy thoughtfully. Why? Julius stared. The mischief was done when we came. Yes, Tommy hesitated. He could not explain his own feeling, the illogical idea that the K.C.'s presence would somehow have averted the catastrophe. He reverted to his former point of view. It's no good arguing about how it was done. The game's up. We've failed. There's only one thing for me to do. 195. What's that? Get back to London as soon as possible. Mr. Carter must be warned. It's only a matter of hours now before the blow falls. But, at any rate, he ought to know the worst. The duty was an unpleasant one, but Tommy had no intention of shirking it. He must report his failure to Mr. Carter. After that his work was done. He took the midnight mail to London. Julius elected to stay the night at Holyhead. Half an hour after arrival, haggard and pale, Tommy stood before his chief. I've come to report, sir. I've failed badly. Mr. Carter eyed him sharply. You mean that the treaty is in the hands of Mr. Brown, sir? Ah, said Mr. Carter quietly. The expression on his face did not change, but Tommy caught the flicker of despair in his eyes. It convinced him as nothing else had done that the outlook was hopeless. Well, said Mr. Carter after a minute or two, we mustn't sag at the knees, suppose. I'm glad to know definitely. We must do what we can. Through Tommy's mind flashed the assurance, it's hopeless, and he knows it's hopeless. The other looked up at him. Don't take it to heart, lad, he said kindly. You did your best. You were up against one of the biggest brains of the century. And you came very near success. Remember that. Thank you, sir. It's awfully decent of you. I blame myself. I have been blaming myself ever since I heard this other news. Something in his tone attracted Tommy's attention. A new fear at his 196 heart. Is there something more, sir? I'm afraid so, said Mr. Carter gravely. He stretched out his hand to a sheet on the table. "Tuppence," faltered Tommy. "Read for yourself." The words danced before his eyes. The description of a green toque, a coat with a handkerchief in the pocket marked PLC. He looked an agonized question at Mr. Carter. The latter replied to it, "Washed up on the Yorkshire coast near Ebury." "I'm afraid it looks very much like foul play." "My," gasped Tommy. "Tuppence. Those devils, I'll never rest till I've got even with them. I'll hunt them down." The pity on Mr. Carter's face him. "I know what you feel like, my poor boy. But it's no good. You'll waste your strength uselessly. It may sound harsh, but my advice to you is, cut your losses. Time's merciful. You'll forget." "Forget, Tuppence? Never." Mr. Carter shook his head. "So you think now? Well, it won't bear thinking of that brave little I'm sorry the whole business confoundedly sorry." Tommy came to himself with a start. "I'm taking up your time, sir," he said with an effort. "There's no need for you to blame yourself. I dare say we were a couple of young FCHJLS to take on such a job. You warned us all right. But I wish to God I'd been the one to get it in the neck. Goodbye, sir." Back at the Ritz, Tommy packed up his few belongings mechanically, his 197 thoughts far away. He was still bewildered by the introduction of tragedy into his cheerful commonplace existence. What fun they had had together, he and Tuppence. And now, he couldn't believe it couldn't be true. Tuppence dead. Little Tuppence, brimming over with life. It was a dream, a horrible dream. Nothing more. They brought him a note, a few kind words of sympathy from Peel Edgerton, who had read the news in the paper. There had been a large headline, XV.A.D feared drowned. The letter ended with the offer of a post on a ranch in the Argentine, where Sir James had considerable interests. "Kind old beggar," muttered Tommy, as he flung it aside. The door opened, and Julius burst in with his usual violence. He held an open newspaper in his hand. "Say, what's all this? They seem to have got some fool idea about Tuppence." "It's true," said Tommy quietly. "You mean they've done her in?" Tommy nodded. "I suppose when they got the treaty she wasn't any gawk to them any longer, and they were afraid to let her go." "Well, I'm darned," said Julius. "Little Tuppence. She sure was the pluckiest little," but suddenly something seemed to crack in Tommy's brain. He rose to his feet. "Oh, get out. You don't really care, damn you. You asked her to marry you in your rotten cold block sled way, but I loved her. I'd have given the soul out of my body to save her from harm. I'd have stood by without a word and let her marry you, because you could have given her the sort of time she ought to have had, and I was only a poor devil without a penny to bless himself with. But it wouldn't have been I didn't care. See here," began Julius temperately. "Oh, go to the devil. I can't stand your coming here and talking about little 198. Tuppence. Go and look after your cousin. Tuppence is my girl. I've always loved her, from the time we played together as kids. We grew up and it was just the same. I shall never forget when I was in hospital, and she came in that ridiculous cap and apron. It was like a miracle to see the girl I loved turn up in a nurse's kit." But Julius interrupted him. "A nurse's kit? Gee whiz. I must be going to Colney Hatch. I could swear I've seen Jane in a nurse's cap too. And that's plumb impossible. No, by gum, I've got it. It was her I saw talking to Whittington at that nursing home in Bournemouth. She wasn't a patient there. She was a nurse." "I dare say," said Tommy angrily, "she's probably been in with them from the start. I shouldn't wonder if she stole those papers from Danvers to begin with." "I'm darned if she did," shouted Julius. "She's my cousin, and as patriotic a girl as ever stepped." "I don't care a damn what she is, but get out of here," retorted Tommy, also at the top of his voice. The young men were on the point of coming to blows. But suddenly, with an almost magical abruptness, Julius's anger abated. "All right, son," he said quietly, I'm going. I don't blame you any for what you've been saying. It's mighty look you did say it. I've been the most almighty blithering darned idiot that it's possible to imagine. Calm down, Tommy had made an impatient gesture. I'm going right away now, going to the London and North Western Railway Depot, if you want to know. I don't care a damn where you're going, growled Tommy. As the CLCNR closed behind Julius, he returned to his suitcase. That's the lot, he murmured, and rang the bell. Take my luggage down. Yes, sir. Going away, sir. I'm going to the devil, said Tommy, regardless of the menial's feelings. 199. That functionary, however, merely replied respectfully, yes, sir. Shall I call a taxi? Tommy nodded. Where was he going? He hadn't the faintest idea. Beyond a fixed determination to get even with Mr. Brown, he had no plans. He reread Sir James's letter, and shook his head. Tuppenny must be avenged. Still, it was kind of the old fellow. Better answer it, I suppose. He went across to the writing table. With the usual perversity of bedroom stationery, there were innumerable and no paper. He rang. No one came. Tommy fumed at the delay. Then that there was a good supply in Julius's sitting room. The American had announced his immediate departure, there would be no fear of running up against him. Besides, he wouldn't mind if he did. He was beginning to be rather ashamed of the things he had said. Old Julius had taken them jolly well. He'd apologize if he found him there. But the room was deserted. Tommy walked across to the writing table, and opened the middle drawer. A photograph, carelessly thrust in face upwards, caught his eye. For a moment he rooted to the ground. Then he took it out, shut the drawer, walked slowly over to an armchair, and sat down, still staring at the photograph in his hand. What on earth was a photograph of the French girl Annette doing in Julius Hershamer's writing table? Chapter XXII. In Downing Street, the Prime Minister, the desk in front of him with nervous fingers. His face was worn and harassed. He took up his conversation with Mr. Carter at the point it had broken off. I don't understand, he said. Do you really mean that things are not so desperate after all? So this lad seems to think. Let's have a at his letter again. Mr. Carter handed it over. It was written in a sprawling boyish hand. Dear M.R. Carter, something's turned up that has given me a jar. Of course I may be simply making an awful ass of myself, but I don't think so. If my conclusions are right, that girl at Manchester was just a plant. The whole thing was prearranged, shampacket and all, while the object of making us think the game was up, therefore fancy that we must have been pretty hot on the scent. I think I know who the real Jane Finn is, and I've even got an idea where the papers are. That last's only a guess, of course, but I've a sort of feeling it'll turn out right. Anyhow, I enclose it in a sealed envelope for what it's worth. I'm going to ask you not to open it until the very last moment, midnight on the 28th, in fact. You'll understand why in a minute. You see, I've figured it out that those things of tuppence are a plant too, and she's no more drowned than I am. The way I reason is this: as a last chance they'll let Jane Finn escape in the hope that she's been shamming this memory stunt, and that once she thinks she's free she'll go right away to the cache. Of course it's an awful risk for them to take, because she knows all about them, but they're pretty desperate to get hold of that treaty. But if they know that the papers have been recovered by US, neither of those two girls' lives will be worth an hour's purchase. I must try and get hold of before Jane escapes. I want a repeat of that telegram that was sent to Tuppence at the Ritz. Sir James Peel Edgerton said you would be able to manage that for me. He's frightfully clever. One last thing, please have that house in Soho watched day and night. 201, yours, etc., Thomas Beresford. The Prime Minister looked up. The enclosure. Mr. Carter smiled dryly. In the vaults of the bank. I am taking no chances. You don't think, the Prime Minister hesitated a minute, that it would be better to open it now? Surely we ought to secure the document, that is, provided the young man's guess turns out to be at once. We can keep the fact of having done so quite secret. Can we? I'm not so sure. There are spies all round us. Once it's known I wouldn't give snapped his fingers for the life of those two girls. No, the boy trusted me, and I shan't let him down. Well, we must leave it at that, then. What's he like, this lad? Outwardly, he's an ordinary clean-limbed, rather block-headed young Englishman. Slow in his mental processes. On the other hand, it's quite impossible to lead him astray through his imagination. He hasn't got any, so he's difficult to deceive. He worries things out slowly, and once he's got hold of anything he doesn't let go. The little lady's quite different. More intuition and less common sense. They make a pretty pair working together. Pace and stamina. He seems confident, mused the Prime Minister. Yes, and that's what gives me he's the kind of diffident youth who would have to be very sure before he ventured an opinion at all. A half-smile came to the other's lips. And it is this boy who will defeat the master criminal of our time. This boy, as you say. But I sometimes fancy I see a shadow behind. 202 you mean? Peel Edgerton. Peel Edgerton, said the Prime Minister in astonishment. Yes. I see his hand in this. He struck the open letter. He's there working in the dark, silently, unobtrusively. I've always felt that if anyone was to run Mr. Brown to earth, Peel Edgerton would be the man. I tell you he's on the case now, but doesn't want it known. By the way, I got rather an odd request from him the other day. He sent me a cutting from some American paper. It referred to a man's body found near the docks in New York about 3 weeks ago. He asked me to collect any information on the subject I could. Well. Carter shrugged his shoulders. I couldn't get much. Young fellow about 35, poorly dressed, face very badly disfigured. He was never identified. And you fancy that the two matters are connected in some way? Somehow I do. I may be wrong, of course. There was a pause, then Mr. Carter continued, I asked him to come round here. Not that we'll get anything out of him he doesn't want to tell. His legal instincts are too strong. But there's no doubt he can throw light on one or two obscure points in young Beresford's letter. Ah, here he is. The two men rose to greet the newcomer. A half-whimsical thought flashed across the Premier's mind. My successor, perhaps. We've had a letter from young Beresford, said Mr. Carter, coming to the point at once. You've seen him, I suppose. You suppose wrong, said the lawyer. 203. Oh. Mr. Carter was a little nonplussed. Sir James smiled, and stroked his chin. He rang me up, he volunteered. Would you have any objection to telling us exactly what passed you? Not at all. He thanked me for a certain letter which I had written to him. As a matter of fact, I had offered him a job. Then he reminded me of something I had said to him at Manchester respecting that bogus telegram which lured Miss Cowley away. I asked him if anything untoward had occurred. He said it had, that in a drawer in Mr. Hershamer's room he had discovered a photograph. The lavier paused, then continued, I asked him if the photograph bore the name and address of a Californian photographer. He replied, You're on to it, sir. It had. Then he went on to tell me something I didn't know. The original of that photograph was the French girl, Annette, who saved his life. What? Exactly. I asked the young man with some curiosity what he had done with the photograph. He replied that he had put it back where he found it. The lawyer paused again. That was, you know, distinctly good. He can use his brains, that young fellow. I congratulated him. The discovery was a providential one. Of course, from the moment that the girl in Manchester was proved to be a plant, everything was altered. Young Beresford saw that for himself without my having to tell it him. But he felt he couldn't trust his judgment on the subject of Miss Cowley. Did I think she was alive? I told him, duly weighing the evidence, that there was a very decided chance in favor of it. That brought us back to the telegram. I advised him to apply to you for a copy of the original wire. It had occurred to me as probable that, after Miss Cowley flung it on the floor, Certain words might have been erased and altered with the express intention of setting searchers on a false trail. Carter nodded. He took a sheet from his pocket, and read aloud, "Come at once, Astley Priors, Gatehouse, Kent." "Great developments, Tommy." "Very simple," said Sir James, "and very ingenious. Just a few words to alter, and the thing was done." And the one important clue they overlooked. What was that? The page boy's statement that Miss Cowley drove to Charing Cross. They were so sure of themselves that they had for granted he had made a mistake. "Then young Beresford is now at Gatehouse, Kent, unless I am much mistaken." Mr. Carter looked at him curiously. "I rather wonder you are not there too, Peel Edgerton." "Ah, I'm busy on a case." "I thought you were on your holiday." "Oh, I've not been briefed. Perhaps it would be more correct to say I'm preparing a case." "Any more facts about that American chap for me?" "I'm afraid not." "Is it important to find out who he was?" "Oh, I know who he was," said Sir James easily. "I can't prove it yet, but I know." The other two asked no questions. They had an instinct that it would be mere waste of breath. "But what I don't understand," said the Prime Minister suddenly, "is how that photograph came to in Mr. Hershamer's drawer." "Perhaps it never left it," suggested the lawyer gently. "But the bogus inspector?" "Inspector Brown." "Ah," said Sir James thoughtfully. He rose to his feet. "I mustn't keep you. Go on with the affairs of the nation. I must get back to my case." 2 days later Julius Hersheimer returned from Manchester. A note from Tommy lay on his table. "Dear Hersheimer, sorry I lost my temper. In case I don't see you again, goodbye. I've been offered a job in the Argentine, and might as well take it. Yours, Tommy Beresford." A peculiar smile lingered for a moment on Julius's face. He threw the letter into the waste paper basket. "The darned fool," he murmured. Chapter XXIII. A race against time. After ringing up Sir James, Tommy's next was to make a call at South Audley Mansions. He found Albert discharging his professional duties, and introduced himself without more ado as a friend of Tuppence. Albert immediately. "Things has been very quiet here lately," he said wistfully. "The young lady's keeping well, sir." "That's just the point, Albert. You don't mean as the crooks have got her?" "They have." "In the underworld?" "No, dash it all, in this world." "It's a H expression, sir," explained Albert. "At the pictures the crooks always have arrests, rant in the underworld. But do you think as they've done her in, sir?" "I hope not. By the way, have you by any chance an aunt, a cousin, a grandmother, or any other suitable female relation who might be represented as being likely to kick the bucket?" A delighted grin spread slowly over Albert's countenance. "I'm on, sir. My poor aunt what lives in the country has been mortal bad for a long time, and she's asking for me with her dying breath." Tommy nodded approval. "Can you report this in the proper quarter and meet me at Charing Cross in an hour's time?" "I'll be there, sir. You can count on me." As Tommy had judged, the faithful Albert proved an invaluable ally. The two took 207 up their quarters at the inn in Gatehouse. To Albert fell the task of collecting information. There was no difficulty about it. Astley Priors was the property of a Dr. Adams. The doctor no longer practiced, had retired, the landlord believed, but he a few private patients here. The gookle fellow tapped his forehead knowingly. "Balmy ones. You understand. The doctor was a popular figure in the village, subscribed freely to all the LCN_L sports, a very pleasant, affable gentleman. Been there long?" "Oh, a matter of 10 years or so, might be longer. Scientific gentleman, he was. Professors and people often came down from town to see him. Anyway, it was a gay house, always visitors." In the face of all this volubility, Tommy felt doubts. Was it possible that this genial, well-known figure could be in reality a dangerous criminal? His life seemed so open and above-board. No hint of sinister doings. Suppose it was all a gigantic mistake? Tommy felt a cold chill at the thought. Then he remembered the private ones. He inquired carefully if there was a young lady amongst them, describing Tuppenny. But nothing much seemed to be known about the patients. They were seldom seen outside the grounds. A guarded description of Annette also failed to provoke recognition. Astley Priors was a pleasant red brick edifice, surrounded by well-wooded grounds which effectually shielded the house from observation from the road. On the first evening Tommy, accompanied by Albert, explored the grounds. Owing to Albert's insistence they dragged themselves along painfully on their stomachs, thereby producing a great deal more noise than if they had upright. In any case, these precautions were totally unnecessary. The grounds, like those of any other private house after nightfall, seemed untenanted. Tommy had imagined a possible fierce watchdog. Albert's fancy ran to a puma, or a tame cobra. But they reached a shrubbery near the house quite unmolested. The blinds of the dining RCK-M window were up. There was a large company assembled round the table. The port was passing from hand to hand. It seemed a normal, pleasant company. Through the open window scraps of conversation floated out disjointedly on the night air. It was a heated discussion on county cricket. Again Tommy felt that cold chill of uncertainty. It seemed impossible to believe that these people were other than they seemed. Had he been fooled once more? The fair-bearded, spectacled gentleman who sat at the head of the table singularly honest and normal. Tommy slept badly that night. The following morning the indefatigable Albert, having cemented an alliance with the greengrocer's boy, took the latter's place and ingratiated himself with the cook at Malt House. He returned with the information that she was undoubtedly one of the crooks, but Tommy mistrusted the vividness of his imagination. Questioned, he could adduce nothing in support of his statement except his own opinion that she wasn't the usual kind. You could see that at a glance. The substitution being repeated, much to the pecuniary advantage of the real greengrocer's boy, on the following day, Albert brought back the first piece of hopeful news. There was a French young lady staying in the house. Tommy put his doubts aside. Here was confirmation of his theory. But time pressed. Today was the 27th. The 29th was the much talked of Labor Day, about which all sorts of rumors were running riot. Were getting agitated. Sensational hints of a labor coup d'état were freely reported. The government said nothing. It knew and was prepared. There were rumors of dissension among the labor leaders. They were not of one mind. The more far-seeing among them realized that what they proposed might well be a death blow to the England that at heart they loved. They shrank from the starvation and misery a general strike would entail, and were willing to meet the government halfway. But behind them were subtle, insistent forces at work, urging the memories of old wrongs, deprecating the weakness of half-and-half measures, fomenting misunderstandings. Tommy felt that, thanks to Mr. Carter, he understood the fairly accurately. With the fatal document in the hands of Mr. Brown, public opinion would swing to the side of the labor extremists and revolutionists. Failing that, the battle was an even chance. The government with a loyal army and police force behind them might win, but at a cost of great suffering. But Tommy nourished another and a preposterous dream. With Mr. Brown unmasked and captured he believed, rightly or wrongly, that the whole organization would crumble ignominiously and instantaneously. The strange permeating influence of the unseen chief held it together. Without him, Tommy believed an instant panic would set in, and, the honest men left to themselves, an 11th-hour reconciliation would be possible. "This is a one-man show," said Tommy to himself. "The thing to do is to get hold of the man." It was partly in furtherance of this ambitious design that he had requested Mr. Carter not to open the sealed envelope. The draft treaty was Tommy's bait. Every now and then he was aghast at his own presumption. How dared he think that he had discovered what so many wiser and clever men had overlooked? Nevertheless, he stuck tenaciously to his idea. That evening he and Albert once more penetrated the grounds of Astley Priors. Tommy's ambition was somehow or other to gain admission to the house itself. As they approached cautiously, Tommy gave a sudden gasp. On the second FLCX, Our window. Someone standing between the window and the light in the room threw a silhouette on the blind. It was one Tommy would have recognized. ADVERSARY. Tuppence was in that house. He clutched Albert by the shoulder. Stay here. When I begin to sing, watch that window. He retreated hastily to a position on the main drive, and began in a deep roar, coupled with an unsteady gait, the following ditty: I am a soldier by my feet. A jolly British soldier, you can see that I'm a soldier. It had been a favorite on the gramophone in Tuppence's hospital days. He did not doubt but that she would recognize it and draw her own conclusions. Tommy had not a note of music in his voice, but his lungs were excellent. The noise he produced was terrific. Presently an unimpeachable butler, accompanied by an equally unimpeachable footman, issued from the front door. The butler remonstrated with him. Tommy continued to sing, addressing the butler affectionately as, "Dear old Whiskers." The footman took him by one arm, the butler by the other. They ran him down the drive, and neatly out of the gate. The butler threatened him with the police if he intruded again. It was beautifully done, soberly and with perfect decorum. Anyone would have sworn that the butler was a real butler, the FCX, tman a real footman only. As it happened, the butler was Whittington. Tommy retired to the inn and waited for Albert's return. At last that worthy made his appearance. "Well," cried Tommy eagerly. "It's all right." While they was a running of you out, the window opened, and 210-something was chucked out. He handed a scrap of paper to Tommy. Wrapped round a letemvate. On the paper were scrawled 3 words, "Tomorrow same time." "Good egg," cried Tommy. "We're getting going." "It was I wrote a message on a piece of paper, wrapped it round a stone, and chucked it through the window," continued Albert breathlessly. Tommy groaned. "Your zeal will the undoing of us, Albert." "What did you say?" "Said we was staying at the inn. If she could get away, to come there and croak like a frog." "She'll know that's you," said Tommy with a sigh of relief. "Your imagination runs away with you, you know, Albert. Why, you wouldn't recognize a frog croaking if you heard it." Albert rather crestfallen. "Cheer up," said Tommy. "No harm done. That butler's an old friend of mine. I bet he knew who I was, though he didn't let on. It's not their game to show suspicion. That's why we've found it fairly plain sailing. They don't want to discourage me altogether. On the other hand, they don't want to make it tchj easy. I'm a pawn in their game, Albert, that's what I am. You see, if the spider lets the fly walk out tin easily, the fly might suspect it was a put-up job. Hence the usefulness of that promising youth, Mr. T. Beresford, who's blundered in just at the right moment for them. But later, Mr. T. Beresford had better link out." Tommy retired for the night in a state of some elation. He had elaborated a careful plan for the following evening. He felt sure that the inhabitants of Astley Priors would not interfere with him up to a certain. It was after that Tommy proposed to give them a surprise. About 12 o'clock, however, his calm was rudely shaken. He was told that someone was demanding him in the bar. The applicant proved to a rude LCK, King Carter well coated with mud. "Well, my good fellow, what is it?" asked Tommy. 211, "Might this be for you, sir?" The Carter held out a very dirty folded note, on the outside of which was written, "Take this to the gentleman at the inn near Astley Priors. He will give you 10 shillings. The handwriting was Tuppence's. Tommy appreciated her quick-wittedness in realizing that he might be staying at the inn under an assumed name. He snatched at it. "That's all right." The man withheld it. "What about my 10 shillings? Tommy hastily produced a 10-shilling note, and the man relinquished his find. Tommy unfastened it. "Dear Tommy, I knew it was you last night. Don't go this evening. They'll be lying in wait for you. They're taking us away this morning. I heard something UT Wales Holyhead, I think. I'll drop this on the road if I get a chance. Annette told me how you'd escaped. Buck up. Yours, Tuppence." Tommy raised a shout for Albert before he had even finished this characteristic epistle. "Pack my bag. We're off." "Yes, sir." The boots of Albert could heard racing upstairs. Holy head? Did that mean that, after all? Tommy was puzzled. He read on slowly. The boots of Albert continued to be active on the floor above. Suddenly a second shout came from Albert. I'm a demmed fool. Unpack that bag. 212. Yes, sir. Tommy smoothed out the note thoughtfully. Yes, a demmed fool, he said softly. But so's someone else. And at last I know who it is. 213.